Good morning. My name is Colette Honorable, and I am honored to moderate this wonderful panel where we will engage in a dynamic discussion regarding the changing generation mix and its associated regulatory issues. Let me begin by thanking FERC, in particular Commissioner Neil Chatterjee, and the incredible team at FERC. It's been wonderful to work with you, as well as our friends, many who are new to me at Virginia Tech. This has been a brilliant collaboration, and I'm honored to take part in the second FERC EnVision Forum. Today, we want to really take a deeper dive into the changing mix, the changing energy sector, and what the future may hold. We don't hold a crystal ball, but we've brought here for you today 4 experts from across the pond and from here in the US to help us really get a handle on what these issues are and how regulators can support the evolution in this ever-changing time. We know that there is a tremendous focus on large-scale solar and wind, solar PV in particular. We are really excited about the technological and R&D advancements, focusing on hydrogen and other sources and resources to aid us in this work, including how energy storage can grow. We've been really pleased to see the work continuing at FERC to support this transition and to also remove barriers to entry for needed technologies such as energy storage, and certainly the ability for distributed energy resources to play a greater role in electricity markets. But there's still so much more to tackle. Our lineup today includes a great group of colleagues. Some of you know them quite well, but I'm pleased to briefly introduce to you, and their bios may be found on the EnVision Forum website. We'll hear first from Brent Warner, and we're so delighted to have Brent with us, and I think that you will be greatly informed by his presentation today. Brent is lead of the World Energy Outlook Power Sector Modeling for the International Energy Agency. And we are so delighted that Brent was willing to bring this really global perspective to us to really shape our view as we are focusing globally, nationally, regionally, and locally. After Brent, we'll hear from Pat Hoffman, who is no stranger to many of us. We're delighted that Pat is still at DOE and is still working hard on behalf of our work collectively as Acting Assistant Secretary with the Office of Energy for the U.S. Department of Energy. Welcome back, Pat. It's wonderful to have you here with us. We have 2 other experts joining us who are very well experienced in their work and bring different perspectives. We will hear next from Mark Labbe, Senior Vice President and Chief Engineer at the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, We know it as NERC fondly. And last but not least, we'll hear from Gordon Van Wheely. Gordon is no stranger to any of us, and we're really so grateful that Gordon is still leading the ISO New England, where he is President and Chief Executive Officer, and frequently lends his expertise and thoughts about the best ways to tackle a number of challenges, new and old, in this sector. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Brent. Brent, welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Colette. And thank you to FERC and, of course, Virginia Tech for holding the event and for the opportunity to participate and speak to you today from Paris, France. Though in the virtual world, we're all side by side and nearby. But I would like to give to present a few highlights and insights from the World Energy Outlook. As mentioned, I lead the power sector modeling and analysis, and I've been a part of now 9 World Energy Outlooks after coming over from the Department of Energy in the US. So I first would like to really talk about kind of 5 points to help set the scene for the overall discussions today. And that's coming from the view of the World Energy Outlook and the International Energy Agency, which is comprised of 30 member countries, 8 association member countries, and we like to point that includes then 80% of global energy demand. So those, the first point, while we're talking about the changing electricity generation mix, we need to first have a view on where electricity demand growth is happening. We have already in the world today, China is the largest system, but as we're moving forward, there's going to be implications from where electricity demand growth is strongest, because the decisions in those countries and regions then will have an outsized impact on technology gains, technology improvements, and where new markets will be opening, where experiences will be, new experiences will be driven. If we look forward, going out over the next 20 years in the World Energy Outlook, we see steady growth in China, a near doubling over that period, but the strongest growth is actually in India, becoming the third largest market in the world, behind only China and the US. Now already this growth means that globally, we're talking about a 50% increase in electricity demand over that 20-year period, and that's in our stated policy scenario, where we're looking at announced and committed policies and where they might lead us. So that's very important to think of how this growth would already be moderated to an effect by energy efficiency. Without energy efficiency efforts, we would have seen 20% more growth at the global level. So then with this point, you can already see that those decisions in Beijing, along with, of course, Washington, D.C., and around the US will have outsized impacts, but then also in India and others. Now, we also explore another scenario, this sustainable development scenario, which is more in line with where we want to go. And I'll talk through a little bit of that, where we are focused on committing 3 sustainable development goals. 1, driving down global CO2 emissions in line with the Paris Agreement. 2, tackling air pollution issues. And 3, providing full access to electricity. So we don't have a single crystal ball, and we don't think of a single forecast for the world. So where do we see electricity growth coming from? How do we meet this demand? In the past, it's been mainly through coal, and this in part is because of where demand growth has been strongest, but also gas, natural gas here, and gas-fired generation, particularly in the US, has been very strong over the past 20 years. But as we look forward, we see this shifting towards low carbon sources, particularly solar PV, wind, and nuclear power, along with hydropower in other regions. And this is ultimately my second point, that falling technology costs and government policies are driving the shift towards solar PV, wind, and other low carbon sources. Solar PV, we're declaring the new king of electricity, and that's really for 3 reasons. First, you have policy support in over 140 countries around the world for solar PV. That's a similar amount for wind power as well. Second, for solar PV, you have very low technology costs. That's been driven down 90% over the past decade. And I know the Department of Energy is targeting new ambitious goals over the next decade to drive down those costs even further. And then a third very important point is on financing costs. We're seeing with that policy support that solar PV is able to access capital at extremely low rates. In an analysis of that last year, we found that these were 3% on average in the European Union, 4% or below 4% in China and the United States, and below 6% in India. And for those that know finance and capital markets, those are extremely low rates. We're also seeing financial support or policy support for wind, both onshore and offshore, and those are poised for very strong growth alongside solar PV. So with that, variable renewables, wind and solar, are set to grow, set to triple in terms of their importance in the overall generation mix in the world, growing from 9% of generation in 2020 to 27% in 2040. And that brings with it a number of moving into uncharted territory for many regions, with some regions even moving towards half of generation by 2040. And the potential is even much, much larger to go further, and we need to go further in order to drive down emissions, not only in the power sector, but across the energy sector where solar PV, wind race in front by an even larger extent and move towards 50% of generation by 2040. So with that, that will then bring me to my third point on flexibility and how this is becoming central to electricity security overall. We think of this today, of course, flexibility is and has always been a part of power systems and reliability, matching changes in demand. But in the future, it will be increasingly about matching changes in demand along with the fluctuations in output from wind and solar PV. So one way to represent that, to visualize that, is looking at the hour-to-hour changes in these large systems when you take demand and subtract out wind and solar PV. So you have here 8,760 dots for each region representing a single hour-to-hour change across the year in 2019. Now that's if you take the entire United States as a whole, the European Union as a whole, India and China. So moving towards the kind of grid congestion we might see or any local effects, and looking at the broader picture. And when we move forward under stated policies, the amount of flexibility in the system, the amount of hour-to-hour ramping that you will need to accommodate increases dramatically. It doubles on average globally. And in these regions you see in the United States, it will be more common to shift the remaining part of the system by 20% from hour to hour. The same in the European Union. India will see that you need to accommodate sort of 50% ramps up and down because of a large dominance of solar PV there. And again, this is on a trajectory where in total emissions are actually flat in our stated policy scenario at the global level. So it's not on track for the kind of change that we actually need. So when you move to then a sustainable development scenario and shares of wind and solar are much, much higher, then this will only increase. And this represents a challenge then for all of the amount of flexibility needed and making sure that we have the investment environment for those sources. So those are power plants, which provide the bulk today, but also networks to move towards, to take the frictions out of the system, but also energy storage. Batteries are gaining in terms of costs are falling and look to play a major role in many regions. But certainly the regulations need to be there to enable that investment. And then demand side response, which in our more aggressive and longer term look, will need to play a much larger role, particularly with electric vehicles becoming a bigger part of electricity demand. I mentioned electricity networks there. I want to highlight a point that the pace of expansion for grids over the next decade needs to be about double what it was over the last decade. This is supporting the clean energy transitions, the expansion of renewables, ultimately meeting new demand growth. And of course, we also need to modernize and rebuild the grid infrastructure that's aging. I'm sure that's a topic we'll talk quite a lot about today. But this is also to say that this investment will need to step up in accordance with that. And there are some headwinds from the very short-term conditions that are creating some risk for this. So we've seen in 2020, looking at the first half of 2020, when the impacts from the COVID-19 crisis were largest, that the grid operator revenues declined by between 3% and 5% in a number of major markets, creating some cash flow issues in the short term, but that risked timely investment for the kind of scale we need in the longer term. So this is an area where we flagged to policymakers that these kind of short-term distortions affecting long-term plans is a real risk for the transitions. And my fifth and final point is that we are actually not on track yet for the kind of clean energy transitions we need in order to move towards net zero emissions by 2050 or as soon as possible. Just in the power sector alone, we have coal-fired generation, which accounts for almost 30% of global energy emissions, and those actually remain flat in the stated policy scenario. What we need to do in a sustainable development scenario is at least cut them in half over the next decade, and even faster than that in a trajectory towards net zero emissions in 2050. Now, to do that, we would then, of course, need to scale up renewables much faster, and in particular, solar PV. Where here, just to demonstrate, we would need to set new records for solar PV deployment in the main leading markets for the technology in the United States, but also in China. India. Wind power would similarly need to scale up. So all of those challenges, which may seem far off into the future, 2040, 2050, if we move to this kind of pathway, we would be bringing them forward, bringing them sooner, and will become more apparent in the markets we have over the next decade already. So with that, I would conclude my remarks, and I would be happy to pass the floor to Pat Hall.
Thank you, Brent. And I'd also like to express, like Brent, my thank you, my special thank you to the organizers of this conference and the very important dialogue that we're having today. My special thank you to Virginia Tech and FERC. It is great to be in a panel and a conference with you all hosting this meeting today. I would also like to express my thank you to Colette, Honorable. It's always a pleasure to be on a panel with you. I respect you highly and appreciate all the guidance and leadership you provide industry, as well as my other colleagues on the panel. I look forward to the dialogue and the discussion that we will have today. I do want to do a special note out to Virginia Tech and the role that universities are going to play critically in the future for educating the next generation workforce. At this stage with the COVID environment, the importance of focusing on the next generation workforce, students at the universities, as well as technology and education is absolutely critical. And please know that you have my support in that education, and anything I can do to help there would be glad to do so. So in my comments, I only have 3 points that I would like to make today. The first point is the President Biden has an aggressive strategy for combating climate change in the United States. 100% clean energy by 2035, net zero by 2050. As was commented by EIA and others, there is a multiple pathways to achieving a decarbonized society, recognizing that every country as well as state may have some slight modifications in how they will get there. But some of the principal elements that I see moving forward is electrification, including the buildings and the vehicle areas as a core component to that strategy, the development of low carbon fuels for the primary reason that we do need some farm capacity in the mix. And so that development of low carbon fuels will be critical. And then decarbonizing the electricity supply. And so those would be the 3 kind of areas that I see complementing what was already presented by Brent in some of the strategy points moving forward. As point number 2, as I look at the electric industry in the United States, we really need to be aggressive in how to develop a plan for meeting these objectives, but doing it with system reliability and affordability in mind as a priority. And so I emphasize those points because there's a lot of things that will occur in this transition. As the share of intermittent generation grows, as was presented in the earlier presentation, we know that we need to think about what is the evolution of the energy market and the capacity market moving forward. And I'll leave it to my friend Gordon to get into the details of that and teeing up that conversation. But the term that Brent had used that we have, I would say, utilized in this industry for several years now is flexibility. And I think we need to really develop some concrete solution sets in the US electric grid for that firm generation, providing that flexibility that's needed. So as I look at it, it really goes back to continuing to develop that zero emission or low carbon emission fuels for some of that firm capacity that can complement the variable generation. Storage may not be the total game changer, but it will be critical to providing important services to the grid. I do believe that storage needs to be looked at from a grid asset point of view. And then also, can it support the market operations? One of the things that storage does is it provides multiple services. And we've spent, gosh, I think for the amount of us that have been on the panel here, greater than 10 years talking about how do we value energy storage. And we need to get beyond that conversation in valuing energy storage. Now, I also would recognize that there's an important role for long-term storage. Other technologies that I think are important for other infrastructure investments to consider is what was already mentioned, transmission capacity, whether it's in the form of new lines, new transmission lines that we need to build in the system upgrades, whether it's voltage and capacity, looking at upgrading the system. And then how do we get more out of the system itself, whether it's looking at dynamic line ratings, power flow control, other things along those lines of really maximizing the capacity on the system. Then the third point that I would like to bring into this conversation, which tends to be a favorite of my conversation, is the need for data studies and analytics, utilizing sensors on the system, but really getting organized so that we can get to a point where we're doing national level planning, that we're integrating what is done at the ISO and RTO level and get to a national level planning capability. I would also like to emphasize that we need to continue to do scenario analysis. Brent brought up some of the important kind of options from what they have looked at, but different parts of the United States really need to think about different scenarios based on domestic resources and local resources that are available on a regional basis. In addition, we need to think about that risk analysis. If anything, ERCOT has continued to remind us of the external factors that affect the development of our system and how we need to consider our investment priorities moving forward. So whether it be weather issues, interdependency issues, I'm sure the conversation of natural gas and our high dependence on natural gas will come into this conversation, but also where congestion may develop in the United States. So there is a very important role with respect to the regional operators, the ISOs, the RTOs, NERC, in moving forward to say, how do we ensure that we're looking at the studies, the analysis, and informing regional leaders on this conversation. So with that, those were the 3 points that I wanted to make. I would like to turn it over to Mark Laube, my friend and colleague, to continue the conversation.
Well, thank you, Pat. And thank you, FERC, as well as Virginia Tech, for inviting me to participate on this panel. I'd like to also join my colleagues in thanking Colette for chairing this session. It's always a delight to be working with her on these issues that are challenging our industry. I also agree with Pat on the importance of the university system and making sure that we have leaders of the future in tackling some of these rather complicated issues, but exciting issues. Ones where you know a power system that 400 million people really are engaged with and depend on, and the technologies that we're pioneering. You know, in 1954, on April 25th, that was Sunday, was when Bell Labs introduced the solar cell and how it could be used to power up a battery. And here we are, some 67 years later, and that's more than a reality. It's not only plausible, but possible. And so it is an exciting time in our industry. You know, as I look at the transformation of this grid, one thing that I've been keying on has been the whole idea of capacity and what happens to that capacity in this new transformed grid. And I've had conversations with many of you about this, and I've learned from all of you when we talk about that problem. Historically, we would calculate a capacity, and it was based on random forced outages. and then we'd calculate reserve margins based on a loss of load expectation. And with that capacity came 4 key things: capacity itself, energy, ramping, and then ancillary services. And what we're seeing now is that's kind of getting separated out. And I really keyed in on energy on the last few years in conversations with Gordon, and of course he'll bring that to light much better than I can. But we used to be able to do this 1 day in 10, and it was based because we didn't have any computer storage to be able to allow us to do any more than that, and calculate on daily peaks, and that was plenty. But now those assumptions around things like, well, I don't have to worry about fuel, it's there, so that's not even part of this random failure of my unit. Now we have this variability or uncertainty around fuel, and either that's through the weather itself, solar and wind, or because of the pipeline capacity or contracts that are being used, or the weather. We're seeing a grid that's transforming itself to be one that's more susceptible to extreme weather. And so we, in keying on that difference, especially when we see widespread events, that's when you start wondering, well, now what do we need to be doing differently than we have in the past? Because the rules of thumb that we've been using are not sufficient. They may at least address one aspect, capacity, for example, but what about some of these other aspects? And so with that kind of historical view in mind, we have to start looking at the problem in really 3 time frames. We look at it from the long term, which and of course Pat's been talking about it, analytical tools. Long term, certainly, it's important for us to be able to design a system that when we hand it to the operators, we'll have those 4 major components. Operational planning, that could be a season ahead, and we have to start thinking of extreme weather management and how we manage the energy during those extreme events, and how that may be different depending on the kind of machines that we have out there, and what kind of weather is plausible, again, as opposed to the 90-10 rule, which is our extreme weather events are with the load levels of 90%, 10%, and then there's the operational time frame. What do we do in the operations? They're kind of tied together with the operational planning of where is my fuel, where's my energy going to come from, what plants are on maintenance, maybe I should have them come off of maintenance. What are some of the different things that I can be doing to be ready for those extreme weather days that we've forecast are coming at us? And then of course, and I'll just make sure that within that planning, that we continue to be scanning the landscape of energy, so we can make sure that we have enough. It comes down to really getting good defined studies, which help us understand what are some of the extreme events that we'll be facing, the scenario analysis that Pat was talking about. We have to take action in all 3 of those time frames, so that we're ready for that type of event, especially as we see on the coming at us in the future. And it'd be at a 21-day rolling average, as they do, for example, in ISO, a 21-day plan that keeps rolling. And again, that system that we're looking at in the future needs to be not only reliable, but secure and resilient, so that we can bring it back after certain events rather quickly, because that's kind of what we're learning here, that those 4 components need to be managed separately, but then together as we kind of go forward in the next day or next week. So with that, I'll be happy to hand it over then to Gordon for his perspectives.
Good morning. Can you hear me okay? Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Colette, and to the rest of my panelists. This is a great conversation. I'm really looking forward to participate, and thank you to FERC and Virginia Tech, for arranging this. So what I've done is to arrange my opening remarks into a series of questions and answers, and hopefully we can stimulate some conversation around them. So let me pose the first question. What does the financial crisis in 2008 and the Texas electrical grid crisis of February 2021 have in common? I suggest that the answer in both instances is that the market participants and the regulators could not foresee and therefore account and plan for the systemic risks resulting from interdependencies that were not visible or well understood. As a result, society incurred these consequences. In the case of the financial crisis, government had to step into the market to rescue the financial system and the major industry participants, and it ultimately led to increased regulation of the financial industry. It remains to be seen what will transpire in the bulk electricity industry as a result of the Texas events, but I'd suggest that a lot needs to be done across the industry to both understand the risks and mitigate them, as Mark was saying. I have another question for you. When faced with low probability, high consequence events, would society prefer a level of insurance afforded by regulation to reduce these risks, or does it prefer the outcomes that we have observed without it? I would again suggest, based on observing public and policymaker reactions to both the financial crisis and the controlled outages in Texas and California, that society may prefer a higher level of insurance that reduces the risks of such events. I also suggest that although some market participants may anticipate and hedge against such risks, it's impossible to estimate future power system risks using probabilistic techniques that are based on historical observations. This is because the future resource mix will be variable and energy constrained. Demand profiles will be very different and higher, and extreme events will have more impact on the production of electrical energy. Simply put, history is not a reliable predictor of the future. I suggest that from a societal point of view, it will be necessary for the regulator to make a judgment and set reliability objectives for the market, and or alternatively impose appropriate regulatory requirements on market participants. In short, we have to define new reliability standards for a world where energy systems have become interdependent and the electric grid will supply the bulk of end-use energy required by society. And those requirements and standards will have to be flexible and regularly calibrated to comport with the evolving circumstances. This leads to the next question. If we cannot rely on historical observations to estimate the probability of future systemic risks, how do we go about understanding these risks and their consequences so that we can think through the implications of mitigating the risks, including who should mitigate them? I think the answer lies through adopting the concept of stress testing from the financial industry. In the wake of the financial crisis, Congress passed legislation requiring stress testing for banks. And as a result, the Federal Reserve now regularly oversees that stress testing. A bank stress test is an analysis conducted under hypothetical scenarios designed to determine whether a bank has enough capital to withstand a negative economic shock. In the bulk power system, we need to use simulation techniques to stress test both the market designs and the performance of the bulk power system under severe conditions. This will allow us to better understand the nature of the risks, engage in an informed discussion about how best to mitigate the risks, and where appropriate, insure against the risks. Mark Lorby is leading an effort at NERC to create a requirement that system operators regularly evaluate the energy adequacy of their regional power systems. This is a form of stress testing, and I applaud and fully support this effort. However, this will not be enough. Once the risks are understood, federal and state regulators, assisted by recommendations from the utilities and the system operators who operate the grid, will have to decide how much of that risk should be proactively mitigated and how much should be left to control the outages when demand exceeds supply. Now, let me ask another question. What should New England learn from the Texas and California events, given that NERC has identified our region as one of the 3 most vulnerable regions in the nation, along with Texas and California? In New England, we are accustomed to cold weather, so our infrastructure is better insulated against severe cold. We've also chosen to complement the energy and ancillary services markets with a capacity market, which is designed to meet the 1-day and 10-year resource adequacy objective. As a result, we have a more predictable revenue stream for merchant investors and consequences for generators that do not weatherize sufficiently or procure enough fuel. Let me expand on this point. We've struggled for years to find a robust solution to the region's well-documented energy security risks during severe cold periods. We initially took the position that generators, when accepting a capacity supply obligation, should also make provision for firm fuel arrangements. This position was fiercely litigated at FERC, and we lost the argument when FERC ruled that if a generator could not physically find fuel in real time, it did not have an obligation beyond the financial consequences established in the market. And obviously, this ruling would apply similarly to renewable energy power generators. This led us to implement the pay-for-performance mechanism, which is necessary but not sufficient to mitigate the risks that are appearing in the evolving power system. We know that we need to do more. Just like the banks are required to have sufficient capital to weather a financial shock, we need to ensure that the bulk power system has sufficient on-call energy stored within or immediately adjacent to the region to withstand an energy supply shock caused by extreme weather. The ISO recently proposed a market-based solution that was designed to promote better forward energy contracting and more energy storage, but it was not supported by the region and ultimately not approved by the FERC. We need to reconsider that proposal once we've reassessed the risks in the light of the events in Texas. I'll provide more context to this in a minute. New England is on a journey to decarbonize its economy by moving heating and transportation demand to the electric grid. This means demand for electricity will likely more than double over the next few decades, and our system will become winter peaking. Simultaneously, in order to supply the vast quantity of clean energy needed to decarbonize, we will have to significantly increase the amount of renewable energy connected to the grid. On average, this will tend to make the region more energy independent, except when the weather is uncooperative. Therefore, if we are not careful, the energy security risks of the region will not diminish, and instead the systemic risk of failure under adverse conditions will increase. The scenario that I'm particularly concerned about is where we simultaneously have high demand of the system during periods of severe cold weather, and we lose production from both gas-fired generators and renewable generators. Under those conditions, we will also be extremely vulnerable to large single-source contingencies. For different reasons, this scenario may be very comparable to the recent Texas events. This is by definition a low probability, high impact event, and we'll be engaging our state regulators, our market participants, and our federal regulators in a renewed search for the right combination of solutions to these risks. But the conversation will only be productive if we can specify the scenarios and the consequences, which leads me back to the need for stress testing and simulating these scenarios. We will soon be starting this discussion in our stakeholder process. So let me close with also making a connection between my concerns about energy security and systemic risks with the conversation that is underway with regard to the elimination of something called the minimum offer price rule in the capacity markets. And Pat mentioned I have something to say about capacity markets. The capacity market is designed to provide the foundational reliability service. It's essentially a provision of a call option on energy when the system is short of operating reserves. It also provides a very important revenue balancing mechanism to offset the lowered revenues in the energy market resulting from the introduction of large quantities of low or zero marginal cost renewable resources. Therefore, the capacity market is a vital source of revenue to the unsponsored balancing resources that we rely on to ensure the system is reliable, and we need to ensure that it remains viable. The MOPR is a mechanism for protecting price formation in the capacity market, but we recognize that it can result in inefficient outcomes over time in the form of duplicative investments in capacity that consumers must bear. The FERC and the majority of the New England states want us to remove it, and we agree that it is no longer sustainable. However, eliminating a component of the capacity market that ensures proper price formation will mean that we will also have to consider adjustments to the other components in the capacity market. We know that FERC has set up a technical conference on this subject in the near future, and we look forward to working with FERC, the states, and the New England market participants on a solution to this thorny problem. And with that, I'll turn it back to Colette. Thank you.
Thank you all, and what a wonderful discussion. I'm sitting on the edge of my seat. We're all a bunch of energy geeks here, and we could do this all day. And I greatly appreciate all of you for bringing, if you could see us all during the other person's presentation, you saw lots of nodding of heads. We have very nicely teed up for everyone at the EnVision Forum the tremendous opportunities that we have. It's truly an exciting time, particularly for us in the US, as Pat mentioned, as we are getting back into the Paris Climate Accords, and also really challenging, as Brent teed up, as Mark referenced from a reliability and resilience perspective, as Gordon referenced from a planning perspective, and really focusing and learning from some, as he mentioned, low probability, high consequence events like we saw in Texas here in the US. We really have tremendous opportunity, but incredible challenges. And so this panel really has done a terrific job in teeing up what those opportunities look like for us, what the challenges may be. We have now time for all of you all who are observing to weigh in, give us your questions. Please send them our way, and I will include them for our very capable panelists today. We also have a few that have already been teed up in the chat, and I'll direct those to our participants in a moment. But I wanted to just take a pause here and reflect upon thinking about threading the needle of every one of your presentations. And it seems that, as Brent teed up very nicely, some of the trends and challenges in terms of electricity demand, trends in terms of the resources that are really quite competitive now, very different from 20 years ago or even 10 years ago, I would say. When we think about the changing energy mix, are there any other trends that you all are seeing, and why do you think we're seeing them? Anyone?
I will jump in. Oops.
Okay.
Please.
All right, I'll start first and then we'll jump to Mark. So I'm going to take it probably a slightly different conversation with respect to, we've already talked about the increasing intermittence and some of the stuff that was already talked about the panel. But I do see the greater need, and a stronger weight needs to be placed on the value of ancillary services, ramping, and those types of services when we talk about flexibility for the system. So we're going to have to, everybody talks about the energy market as the golden nugget, when really nowadays it's really those ancillary services that are going to be absolutely the critical component and piece. The second thing is I really want to emphasize the point that Gordon made. The system is more stiff and it is at more risk. That is a trend that has to stop. And we're going to have to think about how do we make a strong grid and define that strong grid, Mark, by having extra capacity, extra headroom in the system. And how do we do that and allow for the investments to occur as a necessity? Then the third is we have to recognize and acknowledge in our stress test or scenario testing the risk facing the system, whether it be cybersecurity risk, physical security risk, weather risk, interdependencies. We have to recognize that, and that has to be part of the process. And then the last trend that I would like to see occur, back to Gordon, is governors and regulators engaged in those stress test conversations. That is a trend that must occur moving forward, because they're going to be the decision makers in some of those investment scenarios moving forward. So I pause there.
Thank you. Do you want to go ahead, Gordon?
Sure, I largely agree with everything you said. Pat, there's one point that I don't know whether we're in agreement or not. There's a lot in infatuation with ancillary services. I agree they're absolutely necessary, and we have to invent more of them. But as someone who's spent a lot of time thinking about ancillary services and have a great team of people that have designed some of the most innovative ancillary services and have had them rejected because they were too expensive, I can tell you that it's not an easy matter. And the point I'd make is, in all of our modeling, ancillary services are not going to provide enough revenue to pay for all the cost recovery of the capital investment needed to support the grid. So, what we have at the moment is this bifurcation happening on the system. You have resources that are fully sponsored with regard to their cost recovery through state contracts. And it's necessary in order to get these renewables built. And then you have another whole swath of resources that are tasked with balancing the system that have to live on the revenues in the marketplace. And there's only a couple of ways of solving this problem. The one is to do it sort of the traditional way, which is to give everybody cost of service. Another way is to do it the roller coaster method, which is what Texas had tried, and is put a very sort of high scarcity price out there and hope that market participants will hedge. And I would say they probably will never hedge the tail risks. And the third way of doing it is with a capacity market. And I've traveled extensively in Europe and spoken to our colleagues out there. Many of them envy the fact that we've got these capacity markets set up here in the US, even though it's become the thing to hate, right? Everybody hates the capacity markets. I mean, can I tell you from a system operations point of view, I'm not in love with them either because they're a bear to administer. But unless we're going to go back to the traditional method, which the states obviously could do, FERC and the ISOs that have sort of fully restructured are going to be stuck with these capacity markets, and we have to make them work. The way I think about it, the big evolutionary step in the capacity market is to further move towards making these capacity markets drive energy adequacy. So there's a new methodology out there called effective load carrying capability that does that translation. It translates from nameplate capacity into will the resource actually supply energy when it's needed. So that's the whole ELCC concept. You can do that from a probabilistic point of view in terms of looking at what your historical weather patterns might be, and it'll give you reliability on average, okay? But as Texas just showed, reliability on average is not enough. You need to deal with reliability under more stressful scenarios than that. And I think that's where ancillary services comes in, because what you're doing is you're buying another layer of insurance on top of the foundational reliability service. And that's where we can specify we've got to have enough energy stored in the system somewhere in some form, whether it be in LNG or clean hydrogen or in long duration batteries, that when the weather doesn't give us the output we need, we can turn on this other stuff and live through 2, 3, 4, 5 days, 2 weeks. If you speak to folk in Europe, Norway is a great example of speaking to the folk in Norway, they will keep 2 weeks worth of energy in reserve in terms of their hydro to be able to live through periods when they don't get wind production or solar production. And I think we've got to think about it that way in this country as well. Each region is going to have to think about this because, as you pointed out, there'll be different resource characteristics in each region. But this is an issue we have to grapple with. And if I think about it, the regulators need to help set the goals and the standards here. And that's the conversation we have to have.
Yeah, I agree with that. And as I look forward and listen to what we're all chatting about here, we need to get to a new design basis, or at least expand upon the design basis we have. There's a standard that NERC has that what's called transmission planning, but it really takes us down this road of, well, what's the next worst contingencies I need to plan for? Be they loss of generating plants, lines, and so we need to expand that because it has under normal operations an extreme. And so what is the design criteria we're going to be able to withstand with a certain amount of cold weather or certain, how much variable generation can come off and still the system will remain reliable, secure, stable. For that matter, what is the cybersecurity design basis as well? And then we have to scour through some of the standards we have right now and see how we need to update them. For example, a lot of these asynchronous units do not pull out of synchronism. So we need to take a look at some of the existing standards. We also have to look at gas. It is going to be with us for a while. We may get to carbon neutral, but what we saw in Texas was really a gas load becoming a critical asset. And by NERC's definition, a critical asset is a facility, system, and equipment, which if destroyed or degraded or otherwise rendered unavailable, would affect the reliable operation of the bulk power system. This is a very serious matter for us and something we need to build into that interdependency, the two critical infrastructures who are so interdependent that if one fails, the other fails. And we need to be able to build that into our scenario analysis. And again, look at what is going to be the design basis. And I think this gets to what your point was, Gordon, about, how much risk we're going to plan out of it and how much we're going to operate around. And then actually what of it we're going to be able to recover from, because at some point, it's too expensive to build to and what have you. And as I listen to you talk about the ancillary services, what we've done is we've taken some costs out of this system and we got to start putting them back in. Of course, if you just look at the railroads and the coal handling facilities and mines and all that, we've taken all those costs out and we buy things on spot. You and I talked about that one time. But this ancillary services is critical to reliable operation of the power system. So they're going to have to get baked in somehow or another, because the system will not remain reliable. I think from a performance perspective, if we look at the standards, we'll see some potential for folks having trouble being able to meet those standards, unless it's the energy's planned for and the ancillary services are planned for in the future.
Thank you for that. This is, Brent, jump right in. There are no shrinking violets.
Thanks. I mean, a related point, but one I hear in the international conversations, when we very much what we're talking about here is that the markets, I think, are headed towards a complexity, if you like, in the separation of products. And I have to say that is then creates even a larger distance between the energy community and the finance community. And so when we're talking about in the long term an affordable clean energy transition, whatever that looks like, whatever energy mix that is, a big part of that will be lower cost or cheap financing. And so I think we also need to keep that in mind with the regulations, that if there isn't a visibility on your long-term revenue prospects, where will those revenues come from? You'll have this revenue stacking for sure, but will it be sufficient in total? Trying to bring that to a bank and understand the financing side of that is already a challenge, but I think we have to be aware that this is probably only going to be a bigger challenge as we go forward. And so certainly something to think about when we also don't know exactly the energy mix you're going into in 10 years or 20 years.
I think we're going to have to lead when it comes from, unless we have the regulation in place, and that be state and federal regulation in place, that'll provide some of the certainty, at least, on those investments. But if we sit back and then watch things happen and admire the problem, it's only going to get worse and be harder for us to get out of that hole we're digging ourselves. I'm sorry, Gordon.
Well, I was just going to key off something Brent said. So, if you think about this transition, where's the money going to come from for those offshore wind farms that are going to be built tomorrow when they're 20 years old? I mean, presumably we're not going to tear them down and leave them rusting out there off the other side of Cape Cod, right? So this is going to be a world where energy market revenues are going to be quite low. Of course, there will be new ancillary services, but the ocean's a hostile place. So where's the money going to come from to pay for the continual refurbishment of those resources that are going to need ongoing capital investment and maintenance? So I think the energy markets will, by definition, be more compressed with regard to energy revenues. So there has to be a supplemental revenue stream somewhere. We can decide where we want to set it up. We can set it up in the capacity markets. Another good idea, I think, is to put a price on carbon, because I think that will delay the problem. The more you sort of price the environmental objective within the market, the more revenue there will be within the energy market. But I think we've got to think about this on a multi-decade transition in order to provide the stability to the marketplace so that people can make investment decisions and they've got a fair chance at recovering their capital investments.
Indeed.
I'd like to just jump in one last point. Brent brought up a good issue about complexity. And I think that is a caution that we all need to be aware of moving forward. The more complex and the more layers we add to the marketplace, the harder it is going to be for folks to engage into the marketplace. The other thing is we got the consumers on the other side of the equation, and that complexity is going to vote against the consumers and they want to participate, and they're going to invest in distributed energy resources and things along those lines. So as we talk about the complexity issue, I think that is something that we should pay attention regardless of the path that's taken moving forward.
Indeed, absolutely. And I was so pleased to hear Brent reference affordability, because it's such a critical element here. And I'm really pleased to hear us focusing on how this work, how policy, how regulation can spur investment, can spur the development of technologies to aid us in supporting flexibility. You know, I used to, 10 years ago, I used to give a speech about this isn't your grandfather's electricity company anymore. It's not our grandfather's or grandmother's electricity grid. And so it's an exciting time, but a challenging time. And I think I would resolve this entire discussion as we definitely need capacity markets, as complex as they are. And we definitely need to support ancillary services, to Brent's earlier point, and all of you have underscored flexibility is key. I'm going to keep our discussion moving if you all don't mind, because we really could keep going here. There are a number of points I'd like to mention, and I'm harking back to my last technical conference at FERC, where we were really wringing our hands with the really my most challenging task there of trying to sort issues related to achieving energy policy, achieving states who are pursuing clean energy goals, and how that intersects with the operation of wholesale markets, so capacity markets in particular. So I guess it means job security for us all, right? Why don't I go to Brent now? Brent, even at the top, we got some questions for you. So I want to ask you a couple if you don't mind. One is, what role do you see the number of nuclear plants retiring in the US having on the generation needs for the future? Any thoughts there? First, to anyone else who has a thought as well.
Sure. I mean, this certainly connects with also the previous discussion about energy markets. I mean, we've seen very clearly that these challenging market conditions, from extremely low natural gas prices, then filtered into energy markets. So the merchant nuclear plants that are playing there are facing very difficult times. I think this was also touched on by Gordon, of their contributions to the low carbon nature of electricity, or to the overall low carbon package, is not necessarily recognized. And the risk is that these resources, which could continue operating for 20 or possibly even 40 more years, with lifetime extensions that look very cost effective, may be retired early, even before their operating licenses expire. And that would be a shame when we are pushing for more decarbonization, a larger low carbon generation. This is a solid foundation to build off of. These plants have been operating safely for many years, and as long as they continue to operate safely, which of course should be verified independently, then they have a major role to play in providing that foundation. So where they are being retired out of the system, because they are quite large, leaves a large hole in the market there, both for the capacity adequacy that we're talking about. And it may not be an immediate problem, but certainly if electricity demand starts to grow at the rates we're expecting with more electrification and electric vehicles, that would create a hole very sizable in the near term. And also the stability of the overall system that we've mentioned. So you're taking out these large generators at one time. It's a missed opportunity, I think, for affordability, clean energy transitions, and the stability of the overall system.
I couldn't agree with you more, Brent. I also serve as an independent director for Southern Company, and I think that it's more of an immediate challenge than we realize. We do have an aggressive clean energy agenda getting to net zero, and we need every tool, every resource, every technological advancement we can't quite see being fully viable yet. And I really do believe that nuclear will be a part of that. So thank you for taking that question. Brent, I'm going to go to you one more. There was a question from your slides, and the question says, it looks like the width of the flexibility charts might be for 24 hours of a day. If so, then India's future flexibility is most needed at night. I think that was the slide with the demand. There were blue bands and then the green bands for what is needed for flexibility. Is that due to wind is the question, Brent?
Yeah, so in fact, the slide shows those are each a dot for individual hours across the entire year. So you can actually see seasonal effects there rather than necessarily evenings or daytime. And in India, what you see is that there's a very strong preference for solar PV. The wind resources are more limited, though it already is a part of the system and will continue to be. So what you see is a very common pattern when we look at the hourly profiles of solar PV producing a huge amount of energy during the day, much more than is actually can be taken on board by the system, even with demand-side response. And then you actually have peak demand in the evening in India. So peak demand is around 8 p.m. And so solar PV has stopped producing. Now you have your peak demand. So there's a very strong role for an opportunity for battery storage, for example. Just by shifting a few hours can move that what would otherwise be excess solar PV to a time when it's more useful for consumers. But indeed, each region has its own sort of seasonal and daily patterns. I think we focus a lot of our hourly analysis on the United States, Europe, China, and India to get a feel for this. But of course, much more detailed studies like the scenario analysis that Mark, Gordon, Patricia, Pat are all talking about are needed to look at the uncertainties, to look at grid congestion. These are, in some ways, the way we look at it, large regions, no grid congestion. These are ideal systems, and we still see very structural challenges coming. That is aside from all the uncertainties and the operational challenges that other colleagues here know much better than I.
Indeed. Let me keep moving. I don't see anyone piping up there. I think, Brent, you covered everyone's thoughts, so they don't have anything else to contribute on that point. Here's a question that comes from Professor Chen-Ching Liu, our dear friend Chen-Ching, who's one of the planners and leaders of this year's Energy Forum. With a changing generation mix, how do we enhance resilience in large scale? That's for anyone. Gordon.
I'll jump into that. I think it comes back to this energy adequacy concept. So you can do lots of studies, and there are many studies that have been done that will show that if you build out enough renewables with enough transmission and you have enough short-term storage of energy, on average, you'll be okay. But that's not the same thing as resilience, right? And so you need to be able to do better than on average. So it comes back to this, well, how do you firm up the system for days or weeks on end? Because at some point, you're going to hit the weather pattern where your renewables are not going to perform. And I think what's scary about the Texas event, and that's the pattern that worries me, is you might lose your fossil fuels as well. So natural gas was absent. In Texas, it becomes absent in New England because we don't have enough pipelines to bring in the gas. And by definition, actually, over time, we have to reduce the amount of fossil fuels on the system in order to achieve the decarbonization objectives. I do not yet see a focused solution in the US around how do we transition into clean fuels. Pat mentioned it earlier on, and so did Brent. I think here I see Europe and Japan as way ahead of the US. So the focus at the moment in the US is around energy storage in the form of lithium ion storage. But we all know what lithium ion can do. It can help you for 3 or 4 or 5 hours. Maybe 2 days if you're lucky, but it's not going to get you through 2 weeks. And so the balancing energy supply in the US for now is gas. We need to make sure that that system is reliable and there's enough of it. But then the question will become, what do we transition to? And I think hydrogen offers a lot of promise, because we're going to really have to build so much renewable production on the system. There'll be times when we'll have a surplus, and it'll be cheap to actually create clean hydrogen. The problem with clean hydrogen, green hydrogen, is it's very expensive. But we need to think about, how do we repurpose our pipeline systems? How do we start transitioning into a hydrogen gas blend, and then ultimately into clean hydrogen? And in that sense, I think Europe is way ahead of us, and we need to start thinking about that here, because I think it's part of the mix in terms of ensuring a reliable clean energy transition.
And I'd like to add something to that. I think that hopefully the technologies we come up with will allow us to actually create hydrogen and use it right there, so you don't have to transport it around. That molecule's a pain in the butt, needless to say. I'm quite excited about the future and the way in which we can make the system more resilient. If you think about all the work that Pat has been doing in modern grid and smart grids, if we can get it right and we can build security into those systems in the future, then when something happens on the power system, we'll have kind of a backup system, you might say, a smart grid that can take over for a while anyway, until we get the bulk system back up online. I know that we have to worry about some of these widespread, long-lasting events. And so this also starts speaking to, how do we prepare for those? I think batteries can have a role. You're right, they don't last a long period of time. It could have been nice to have had batteries, let's say, or some sort of dual fuel, Gordon, I don't know what, that supported the gas processing plants when they got cut off, or a compressor station, or a wellhead to provide the winterization. That thinking doesn't actually occur, and that may not be the solution. Maybe lithium batteries aren't the solution. Maybe it's a microturbine or something. But we can make the system more resilient and build it if we build in. But we have to get to a point of what are we designing to, right? And what is the design basis?
I think this is where the regulator and entities like NERC can help. I mean,
Yeah.
The easy way to solve the interdependency in Texas for the gas system is make sure that the compressor stations run off their own fuel, right, and not off the electric grid. So we created an interdependency there.
Yeah.
And so I think those are the kinds of things we need to look for. Just like my earlier remarks with regard to the financial system, and we didn't understand collateralized debt obligations and how that ended up being the Achilles heel in the financial collapse. We've got a number of these Achilles heels in this interdependent system that's evolved over time, and we're actually going to expand upon them, in the sense that we're going to double the electricity demand, and then we're going to add a bunch more resources that are variable in nature. So when demand is twice what it is today and the renewables don't show up, the gap that we have to supply is going to be much bigger than it is today. So how do we focus in on that problem? And I think, to me, from a resilience point of view, that's the issue that we're all hoping there'll be some wonderful solution. And for years now, I've been here and visiting universities who have demonstration projects on long duration batteries, and they're always 2 years away from commercialization. And I've been hearing that story for 2 decades now. So I look at it and say, okay, it's not coming anytime soon in terms of long duration batteries. And that's why I'm sort of focused on hydrogen, to be honest with you, because it's a known technology, you know how to make it, it's expensive, yes, but we're going to have clean energy. So if we can find a way of, you can put 20% hydrogen into an existing pipeline. They feather in the molecules in between the methane molecules. And so I think we need to pay more attention to that, because I'm not seeing what the engineering solution is to this problem. And I think that is a more feasible solution, for example, than large-scale carbon capture.
So if I can add one comment to this, and Colette, to the question that we're talking about here, I think there's always two things that we have to ask ourselves as part of the conversation. how much storage do we need, whether it be in the fuel storage, battery storage, or other forms of storage, but how much storage do we need when we talk that will buy some cushion from a resilience point of view? And then it goes back to the speed that we're either able to bring on new capacity or recover or rebuild from a resilience point of view. And so we need to constantly ask ourselves those two questions when we want to think about resilience.
Just on the storage, it's a huge amount. It's a huge amount. When you look at doubling the demand, the electrical demand on the system, and then you run a scenario where you knock out most of your renewable production, it's dramatic. And so I think there is a solution today, but it's got a carbon footprint associated with it. It's called natural gas. So if, as long as you've got your natural gas system and it's robust, you can solve that problem from an engineering point of view. But the real problem is, well, it can't be natural gas 20 years from now. There has to be something else that has a similar energy footprint and is as you can turn it on as needed.
Maybe if I could jump in there, Gordon, I mean it's a very good point. And I mean, one we're thinking a lot about of how to also make the best use of the existing infrastructure you have, the existing power plants that are there. We've built a lot of gas-fired power plants in the US in the last 20 years. They have a lifetime ahead of them, but we also need to make sure they're consistent with the overall climate goals and overall CO2 emission goals. So I fully agree on hydrogen. Technically, this is something where we're talking with the manufacturers, but also country plans where co-firing a very high share of hydrogen in gas-fired capacity is already possible with some degree of retrofits. And that the next wave or the next generation of gas turbines, also the intention is to be able to co-fire 80% and above of hydrogen, so that you could have where an existing asset, you're taking advantage of the grid connection of it being there already. The challenge will be getting the fuel there, but you could potentially have the operational characteristics of the gas-fired power plant without the emissions. And as you said, there's an intention where we also agree that today hydrogen, and particularly low carbon hydrogen, is expensive, and that looks to be the case for some time. But with dedicated renewables, the cost of those coming down, the cost of low carbon hydrogen should be coming down. And it's even if it's expensive, if it's something you don't use very much, and we think of gas-fired capacity again in this kind of peaking terms, then the impacts on costs hopefully aren't so large for consumers at the other end.
Thank you all. And I would love to chime in here, but I'm going to do my job as moderator and make sure I clear these other questions that we have. We have one from, this question is for Pat and for Mark. The revenue is based on kilowatt hours, but grid reliability calls for transient and short-term active and reactive power. How do you expect to pay for such needs?
I'll have you. You can have it, Pat, if you want. No, I look. There are standards to reliability, and those standards call for the ability to have this, ancillary services to support the system, and those standards have been written by industry, and they follow them, and that's part of their planning. That's got to be part of their planning, certainly when they're looking at season ahead and the day ahead. Nevertheless, long term. So. They, as far as getting paid for them, generally you get if you're in a non-market, that's a no-brainer. It's there, and the in markets, I imagine they're working on that problem to make sure that they do have ancillary services. You heard Gordon talk about it, and looking at different types of markets. We can't. The system will not remain reliable if you don't have frequency, if you don't have voltage. You have to have it, otherwise even your asynchronous resources that are frequency following need a heartbeat. So you're going to have to go one way or the other as part of your design.
And it's about recognizing the different attributes that these resources provide and how we can support them.
We can design it into your system, right? Like a solar, you can actually have a solar facility that provides VARs, and that's all it does is provide VARs. You're going to have to pay for it. VARs being reactive power, excuse me. But you have to design it and run it that way.
Yeah.
Gordon, were you raising your hand? Pat may have a thought here.
I just was going to add to the conversation of everybody keys on the value of the energy market and the real energy. And we have basically, no fuel as you look at the renewable energy from that perspective. So how do we get the community writ large to understand the value that ancillary services provides, and then to provide the appropriate compensation for that? And I think that goes to the crux of the complexity that we've already talked about. So that's the only thing I would add.
Thank you, Pat. Gordon.
Yeah, so a couple of things. I think the problem with reactive power doesn't travel very well. And so it's very locational. And therefore, it's going to be very hard if you need it to be provided by a certain resource at a certain location. It's going to be very hard to create a market around that. So market designs work best when you've got competition and that the product is fairly fungible and it can travel, right? So that's not the case with certain reliability attributes. Reactive support is one of them. Inertia is another. So I think these are going to be very complicated things to deal with. The National Grid in the UK had a rolling outage event a few years ago. They're the first system I know of where inertia, the loss of inertia was the problem. So it was, the UK system is a very big system. It's 70, 80 gigawatts. And a relatively small trip of an offshore wind farm and a land-based combined cycle put them into load shedding conditions. And that was really because of the fact that they didn't have sufficient inertial response. It's been one of the dimensions of that outage. So I think, yes, we need to look to see whether we can actually develop ancillary services, but some of these are going to have to probably just be rolled in as part of the cost structure.
Part of your transmission.
Use one example today, black start capability. There's nobody in the world that's doing black start through a market because you've got such a locationally specific need. And so those are just going to have to be rolled in as part of your tariff, and you'll have to pay the provider directly for providing that service.
And that is okay to acknowledge that we need to roll in some of these. And I think everybody gets enamored that we've got to create a market for everything and the complexity. But that acknowledgement, thank you, is there some things we just need to deal with.
That's right. That's right.
But I hear something else about complexity, because I think I hear what you say, Pat. I hear a lot of people say that, and we can forget about reducing the complexity. The complexity is only going to go up. It's going to become more and more complex. Well, there's no way of stopping that. I mean, we're hooking up every piece of energy demand to the grid, and we're looking to decarbonize it at the same time, and we want to do that through markets. I mean, it's going to be just incredibly complicated. I think the real issue, though, is having the end consumer actively involved in utilizing their energy in concert with what's going on in the grid. So there's a big regulatory breakthrough needed. I mean, at the moment, most consumers are completely oblivious to what's going on in the grid. And when we've hooked up the heating supply and the transportation and everything to the grid, and it becomes the single point of failure, we better have more feedback, a better feedback loop between what's happening on the grid and what's happening with the end consumer. And so from a regulatory point of view, that's a massive barrier right now for having end use participation in a manner that's useful to grid reliability.
Indeed. And I think there certainly was an awakening that we observed in Texas. I think it was fascinating to me to see everyday people really tuning in because they had to, and it was certainly life-threatening. I was heartened, Gordon, to hear you say that's where the regulators come in. If we had more time, we could talk about that and what is the role of the regulator. And I want to, if the organizers will indulge me, because it's perfect with this discussion that we're having, one last question. Are the burdens for electricity markets becoming too great to assure system reliability and public safety? We have subsidies and state-mandated portfolio standards for intermittent resources. We can't assume that natural gas will be available at generation plants. Importantly, the societal costs of blackouts are largely external to the electricity markets. Do any of the panelists see pressures for states in the RTO ISO structures to remove themselves and return to the cost of service model? I know we've seen some discussion, not in one that Gordon is leading, but in other RTOs or ISOs. But do you all have any thoughts there on this topic of it is going to only get more complicated to operate these markets? Gordon.
I think there are definitely risks, and we've talked a lot about the risks. I think the states want credit for the renewable resources that they're signing up for within the context of the wholesale markets. And that's what the whole conversation's about. For states to remove themselves from an RTO market is generally a very expensive proposition.
Yes.
So I think they can do it. I mean, if they're situated in a manner that they have the resource base that they've got under their control, that's fine. And the bigger the state is, and the more independent it can be, the easier it'll be for the state to do that. But in general, my reading of the situation is that most states are going to want to maintain their presence in these RTO markets because it's cost effective.
That's right. And I'll finish your sentence there. It's cost effective for end users and consumers.
Exactly.
And that's a critical element that we have to keep in mind.
But what they want is they want the credit for the contracts they're signing, and they want the ability to shape the resource mix. Mm-hmm. So that's the friction point between federal and state policy. There are many ways of solving this problem. One of them is carbon pricing at a national level or even a regional level, but we can't get there politically. And so we're going to end up with these workarounds. And so, the minimum offer price rule was one workaround. It's not sustainable. We have to get rid of it. And so we'll find other workarounds, but there are going to be efficiency trade-offs as we seek these workarounds.
Indeed. Well, if you all don't mind, I'm going to let Gordon have the last word there. Brent, Pat, Mark, Gordon, thank you. This was a wonderful discussion. I look forward to next time. Thank you all. And thank you all for tuning in.
Thank you very much.